Who is the happiest person you've ever known? The happiest person I think I've ever known was an old lady living in the African township of Duduza, just southeast of Johannesburg. Her name was Gogo Mogali, and Gogo means old lady or granny. And Gogo Mogali lived in a small four-roomed house with a very small garden with an outdoor toilet. She had married late in life and had no children or grandchildren of her own. When I first met her, she must have been in her 80s, and she had a little dog. I think it was a fox terrier, and his name was Billy. Billy would spend a lot of his time wandering the neighborhood, but he knew where his home was. Every morning, Gogo Mogali would make herself some breakfast, which consisted of a bowl of firm mealie meal porridge, which in Zulu is called putu, and a cup of tea, which she would share with Billy before he was off on his daily rounds. Gogo Mogali's knees gave her problems. Knees in Zulu are amadolo. Every time I saw her, I was aware that her amadolo were giving her problems. Too many birthdays, as people would say here in Northern Ireland, and possibly also too much bending down and kneeling, keeping her vinyl tiled floor in her home spotlessly clean. But despite her bothersome amadolo, her painful knees, and her very, very modest home, she radiated a happiness that was infectious. Not all the old ladies living alone in Duduza were happy, as she was happy. Some homes were dark and depressing, and some of the old Gogos I visited were weighed down by emotional scars and wounds that they had clearly carried for many, many years. Abusive marriages, oppressive working conditions, an oppressive apartheid system that they had grown up under. But Gogo Mogali had a lightness and a brightness about her, a happiness that I don't think I will ever forget. It was a gift to all who knew her and met her. At her funeral, we sang her favorite hymn in Sotho. The English version you might know. I hear thy welcome voice that calls me, Lord, to thee, for cleansing in thy precious blood that flowed on Calvary. I am coming, Lord, coming now to thee. Wash me, cleanse me in the blood that flowed on Calvary. And the Bible text that I preached on at her funeral was from Isaiah 35, from verse 3 to 6. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The text not only gave hope for one who had suffered with failing knees, but also captured something of the joy that radiated from her, that gushed forth from her like streams in a desert. Needless to say, her funeral was large, and it was a celebration. And as the chorus of her favorite hymn was sung, the congregation in true African style couldn't help but dance. I am coming, Lord, coming now to thee. Wash me, cleanse me in the blood that flowed on Calvary. Who is the happiest person that you've ever known? And what was, or perhaps is, the source of their happiness? Today I'd like to start a preaching series examining the Beatitudes of Matthew 5, 1 to 12. They kind of the opening section of what is called the Sermon on the Mount, the first teaching section in Matthew's Gospel. And the word beatitude comes from the word beati in Latin. I'm not sure if I've pronounced that right, beati. In the Latin version of Matthew 5, 1 to 12, the word that is translated in English as blessed or blessed is the Latin word beati, and it means to be happy, to be rich, to be blessed. The original Greek word makaroi, and again I can't say I'm pronouncing this necessarily correctly, it includes these meanings, but it goes one step further with the meaning enviable. It raises the question, who do you envy in life? Who are those that you regard as blessed, rich, and happy? Our culture teaches us that those who are blessed, those who are blessed, who are rich, happy, and to be envied, are those with lots of material possessions. The more possessions you have, the bigger your house, we are told, the more happy you should be. That is the voice of our cultural conditioning. And so those who are envied the most in our culture are the millionaires and the billionaires. And the way to true happiness comes when you have lots and lots of money and you no longer need to depend on anyone else. You can even jet yourself off on your own private mission into space. This is the way to happiness, we are told. And this was the general belief also in the Jewish culture of Jesus' day. Those who were blessed by God were those with lots of possessions, lots of money, big houses, and lots of fields. But is this necessarily true? Isn't it interesting that the first time Jesus is portrayed as teaching in Matthew's Gospel, and there are 5 sections in Matthew's Gospel with teaching, the first thing he teaches is about how to be truly happy, how to be truly rich, how to be truly blessed. Jesus wishes to teach qualities that are enviable. But as we shall see over the next few weeks, Jesus' teaching takes us by surprise. The way to happiness that Jesus teaches in Matthew's Gospel is a little different from the way our culture teaches us as the way to happiness. As we will be exploring the Beatitudes over the next few weeks, I'd like to reflect briefly on the opening verses of the text. It begins in verse 1. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside. He sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. The word for seen in the phrase having seen the crowds is the Greek word idon or idon. It's a word that encompasses both a physical seeing as well as an inner knowing or perception. It suggests that to truly see is not just to see the surface of things with the physical eyes, but rather to see with an inner knowledge, a perception, to see with understanding. In my first year of university, a fellow student had the name Beka Borna. And when I asked him what it meant, he said it means to look and see. Beka means to look. Borna means to see. It is possible to look, but not to truly see. But when Jesus sees the crowds, he not only looks, but also sees. When Jesus sees the crowds, he sees not just the surface of things, seeing them not just as physical beings, but as spiritual beings with inner depth and inner needs. This sense of Jesus looking and seeing beneath the surface of things comes through later in Matthew's Gospel, when Jesus again looks at the crowds, and he is moved with compassion, because they are like sheep without a shepherd. Having looked and seen the crowds, we read that Jesus goes up a mountain. In Matthew's Gospel, this is significant. One of the things that Matthew wishes us to see about Jesus is that he is like a new Moses. Just as Moses went up Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, the law, the way, or the teachings, and this was received for a bunch of slaves who had just been rescued from Egypt, so Jesus goes up the mountain to provide teaching for the crowds whose deep spiritual need he has just seen. Jesus, according to Matthew, is a new Moses. But Matthew wishes us to see that Jesus is not just like Moses. He's greater than Moses. Moses waits to receive the law from God before taking it to the people. But according to verse 2, the words of the teaching, the way, the law, come from Jesus' own mouth. He opens his mouth and begins to teach them himself. What's interesting, however, is that on this occasion, although Jesus sees the need of the crowds, he does not call the crowds up the mountain. He calls his disciples. The word that is used is mathetai. It means learners or pupils. The word math in mathetai, from which is the portion of the word from which we get our English word for mathematics, and it means to think things through. The teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and in these Beatitudes is firstly directed not to the crowds but to learners, pupils, who Jesus invites to think more deeply about the true meaning and the true purpose of life, rather than the surface explanations that our culture often gives us. The word mathetai, or disciple, occurs more in Matthew's Gospel than any of the other three Gospels. In fact, more than any of them combined. And some suggest that Matthew's Gospel was the earliest manual for Christian discipleship. Some have even suggested that the title of Matthew's Gospel is meant as a play on words. Mathetai, meaning disciples, or disciples, sounds similar to Matthaios, from which we get our word Matthew. Is it possible that Matthew's Gospel got its name as a play on words of one of its central themes, the making of mathetai, or disciples? The name Matthew could be interpreted in more than one way, but the most popular meaning or understanding of the name means gift of God. Mattheyahu in Hebrew, I believe. I wonder if the writer of Matthew's Gospel wishes us to see that as we become learners, pupils of the way of Jesus, as we respond to his invitation to ponder and think more deeply about life, to think more deeply about the true meaning and the true purpose of life than just the surface explanations that our culture gives us, the goal is that disciples, mathetai, should be transformed into the gifts of God, so that we might become a blessing to others, to the crowds, that we might become salt and light, as Jesus says just a little bit further on in the Sermon on the Mount. We become transformed from mathetai, disciples and learners, into matheios, gifts of God, bearers of the good news to the world. Amen.